Most homeowners think that selling a house just means putting it on the market, paying their fees at closing, and moving on. But when you really break the numbers down, there are usually a few different costs involved, and one of them tends to catch sellers off guard when they finally see those statements at closing. So, in this video, I want to walk you through what it really costs to sell your home here on the Treasure Coast, what those expenses usually look like, and how to think about them before it comes time to list and sell your home. If we haven't met, I'm Ronnie Densmore, and I'm a local realtor here on Florida's Treasure Coast. And on my channel, I like to make videos to help homeowners understand today's market, the selling process, and the real numbers behind it all so you can make better decisions without any of the guesswork. And this is honestly one of the biggest questions that sellers have early on. So let's break it down. The first category that most sellers think about is the real estate compensation side of the transaction. Now, this is where I want to be very careful and make sure to keep it accurate because a lot of people still think there's just one standard number that applies to every sell. And that's just not the best way to look at it because it's not true. What a seller agrees to pay for listing representation does get discussed up front. Other than that, everything else is a variable. Depending on the exact listing agreement, the services that are being provided, the specific brokerage or agent that you choose to work with, and how the overall deal is structured. In other words, this is not something that's just automatically the same with every transaction. So the big takeaway here is to not think of this as some fixed automatic formula. It's better to think of it as one small part of the total cost of selling and one that should be understood clearly before the home ever hits the market. And this matters because the representation that you hire is supposed to do more than just get the property listed online. They should make sure that you understand this fully, as well as help with pricing, strategy, your marketing, negotiations, managing timelines, handling all of your inspections, and in general, just keeping the transaction together from contract to closing. So, while this is one of the biggest costs to sellers, it's also one of the most important, and it's a conversation that should be had very early on. That way, you have clarity up front and we prevent surprises later. Now, the second category is your closing cost. This is a part that a lot of homeowners don't think about until we're much further along in the process, nearly to the closing table. In Florida, sellers often have closing related expenses that are tied to the transfer of the property. That can include things like your dock stamp taxes, the deed and title related searches, settlement or closing fees, your prorations for your homeowner's taxes, as well as sometimes you have your HOAs and condo fees should your home be in one of those types of communities. This category can vary from deal to deal, but in most cases, the closing cost for a seller ends up being roughly 1 to 2% of the total sales price. So for easy math, let's say that we sell your home for $400,000. That would put you in the ballpark of roughly $4,000 to $8,000, depending on the exact details for your closing costs. And this is one of the reasons I always think that a seller should look at the net proceeds from the sale, not just the sales price. Because getting a certain number for the house is great, but what you walk away with after all of your expenses are accounted for is what actually affects your next move. Now, the third category is preparing the home for sale. And this is where numbers can vary a lot. Some homes, such as our new construction, need very little. Some of our older homes need a decent amount of work before they're truly ready to compete and go on the market. And that does matter, especially in today's market, where buyers have so many more options than they did during the peak period a few years back. Preparations can include small things like touch-up paint, minor repairs, landscaping, pressure washing, deep cleaning, hauling things away, or even staging and small cosmetic upgrades. It does not always mean a major renovation, and actually, most times, The best return comes from doing the simple things very well. Let's clean it up, brighten it up, and declutter it. Fix the obvious stuff and make it easy for a buyer to envision themselves there and say yes. For some sellers, that number is only a few $100. In other cases, it could be a few thousand. So a reasonable number I like to give is somewhere between $2,000 to $5,000 for repairs, although some homes can absolutely fall outside of that in either direction depending on the condition of the home. And here's why this part matters so much. A lot of sellers look at prep work as just another expense going out. But a better way to view it is that these are improvements helping the home show better, creating a stronger first impression, and reducing objections that a potential buyer will have, helping it sell faster and for more money. If the answer is yes to any of those things, then some of the costs are not just expenses. They're a part of the strategy. And on the Treasure Coast right now, strategy matters more than it did when things were selling as soon as they were hitting the market. Buyers are paying attention. They're comparing condition, they're comparing prices, and they're comparing updates. Oftentimes, the home that feels the most dialed in ends up with an advantage. Now, there are also some optional costs that not every seller will have, but they do come up often enough that they're worth mentioning here. Sometimes a seller will choose to do a pre-listing inspection, pay for professional staging, and oftentimes there are specific reports or certifications that become helpful depending on the age or condition of the property. And sometimes a seller will even end up having to make repairs during the inspection period after we go under contract, which is yet another reason why it's such a good idea to leave room in your expectations. Now, not every sale is going to be the same. Some homes are going to be very straightforward and have no repairs needed. Others are going to need a little bit more love and have a few more moving parts. Now, let's take all of this, put it together into an example, and make it real for us. Let's use the same $400,000. Let's say your home sells for $400,000. Your closing costs are going to be somewhere between that $4,000 to $8,000 range, and your prep work ends up being around $4,000. That already puts you between $8,000 and $12,000 of your real money going out before you even get into the real estate compensation side of the transaction. Then, when you factor in whatever we agreed to for the representation, the overall structure of the deal, a lot of sellers realize pretty quickly that the true cost to sell is more than they had first assumed. And that's why this conversation matters, because most homeowners do not need a sugar-coated version of the process. They need realistic expectations and to know what they may spend, what they may walk away with, and how to plan ahead so they're not blindsided when it comes time to sell. And the good news is, a lot of homeowners on the Treasure Coast have a ton of equity, especially if you've owned for several years. Even after your selling costs, most sellers are still in a good position and walking away with a great plan to move forward. But the smartest thing you can do is understand your net proceeds before making a move, not after. Because whether you're selling and buying again, downsizing, relocating, or trying to move around work, school, or family, numbers matter. Timing matters. And your plan matters. That's why I always think sellers should ask better questions than just what can I sell for? Questions like, what am I looking like after all of my expenses, my timeline, and today's market? Those questions give you something useful that you can use to put a real plan together. So, if you're thinking about selling here on the Treasure Coast and you want to help figure out what your numbers might look like for your home, that's exactly the type of conversations that I help people with every single day. You can use any of my links below to either schedule a call through my Calendly link, request a personal home valuation, or download my seller guide. We can take a look at the value of your home the likely selling costs, what you may want to do before we list the property, and what your estimated net proceeds look like so that you can make a decision based on real numbers instead of guesswork. And if you found this video helpful, make sure to subscribe because I'm going to be putting out more videos on the Treasure Coast market, the home selling process, and the things homeowners should understand before getting ready to make that next move.